Hello, I'm Kurt Lidke, Executive Director of Klamath Film, and you just watched Youth v. Gov, an extraordinary documentary profiling the efforts of youth to demand accountability for climate change. With us are the filmmakers, Christi Cooper and Olivia Ahnemann. Thank you both so much for joining us and for making this incredible film.
Thanks, Kurt. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
So what first attracted both of you to this project?
Well, my journey with this film and story kind of goes back almost 10 years now. I originally joined a grassroots campaign effort with a 10-part short series of films that featured young plaintiffs from across the country who were suing their state governments. And some of those plaintiffs happen to be in this current case, in the Juliana case. So I worked with our Children's Trust, who's the legal organization who represents these kids, way back then on creating these films and using these films in the courtrooms and getting those films before President Obama. So when they filed their new case in 2015, I kind of already had my foot in the door. I had some relationships with several of the plaintiffs and with Julia and the legal team, and had earned their trust, so to speak, when it comes to filming with young people and being involved in legal stories. And so I started filming in 2016 after their first win with Judge Coffin.
And Olivia, how did you get involved in the project?
So I joined Christi in the beginning of 2019. We were introduced by some mutual friends and colleagues, and I had worked on a couple of other films that had dealt with environmental issues and climate change, and I was not sure that I was ready to dive into another film that with climate change being sort of like the main subject. But the way that Christi was telling this story and these young people, and that it was more of a story, almost a whodunit story, looking back at our history and government action to perpetuate the climate crisis. I was just really attracted to looking at climate change in a different way, looking at a potential solution in a very different way. And the characters, from the lawyers at OCT to the kids, were just a fantastic group of individuals.
Great. Well, I recall reading newspaper articles and hearing about this case, particularly since it was taking place in my hometown of Eugene. This case is a multi-year process, and the film was finished before the legal matters were. So where do things currently stand with it? Are we going to need a Youth v. Gov Part 2 to update things, or what?
Probably. And who knows how long it's going to go on. So where the film ended, there has been some traction in the courts since the end of the film. So in the beginning, or in March of this year, the plaintiffs filed what's called a motion to amend their complaint. And they want their original complaint to be more in line with how the Ninth Circuit Court ruled, so that the focus is more on the declaratory relief, which is similar to the original Brown versus Board of Education case. So there was a hearing for that motion on June 25th with Judge Aiken in Eugene, and we're waiting for her decision on that as to whether or not she's going to allow them to amend that complaint. We're very hopeful that she will, and she's going to take her time with that decision. She probably won't have that decision out until, much later this fall, maybe early winter. In the meantime, she also ordered the Department of Justice attorneys to begin settlement discussions with the plaintiffs, confidential settlement discussions. So those have been ongoing since before the hearing. And of course, since they're confidential, I can't really report on anything about that. I don't know anything about how those conversations are going. And then in addition, there's been some interesting things that have happened with some interveners on the case. So similar to what happened very early on in the case, where the entire fossil fuel industry intervened in the case and was defending with the government for almost 3 years and then left. We now have 18 Republican state attorneys general who have filed a motion to intervene in the case and want a seat at the settlement table. And they've already said in their motion that they have no intention to settle. So they're really coming into this with bad faith and clearly, to be obstructionist to any kind of climate agenda that the Biden administration might be able to settle with this case. Because from our understanding, a court-supported resolution could really provide some long-lasting climate policies that a subsequent administration would not be able to overturn through executive actions and legal actions. Legislative action, sorry.
This seems like something that could elevate all the way to the Supreme Court if need be, right?
Yes, the case has already gone up to the Supreme Court twice, and we definitely expect it to make its way up there again. We're much more hopeful that this motion to amend the case, should Judge Aiken rule in the plaintiff's position, would allow the case to get back on the track to go towards trial, and with the hopes of going to trial sometime next year. And I would imagine that regardless of whether it goes to trial, it probably still will go back up to the Supreme Court again.
Well, the timeline for the courts can be very slow, and when you're making a film about courts and court decisions, hand in hand, the filmmaking process can be very slow. Very slow, because you're oftentimes, it's a stop-start thing, right? You're filming and then you have to wait 6 months for a court ruling and then film again. So, what was the timeline like for creating this project? Since the courts move slow, how many years in the making was it? And at a certain point where you're like, we can't just sit around and wait for the courts. We need to actually, get a film in the can. Do we just put it out now before there's a final resolution on the case?
Olivia, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So Christi started making this film when it was first filed, and the case was first filed in the federal courts in 2016. So we're 5 years into it. We finished the film in November of 2020. So that was a 4-year timeline. And as you mentioned, Kurt, you like with all documentary films, you have to follow the events of what's happening with your characters and with the story. So Christi would go out in the field and film when there were these court hearings. And I think it's important for the audience to remember, like, nothing that you saw in the film is actually the case going to trial yet. These are all procedural court hearings. So no evidence is being presented. And it's just, as one of the characters in the film says, it's these shenanigans of like in and out of court with all these different legal procedures being kind of like thrown at the plaintiffs all the time. And then at some point, we were in discussions both with our editing team and as, the production team of, this is an urgent issue. With all films, you've got budgets to pay attention to, and you can't just keep stringing out and waiting for this judicial process to play out. And we felt like we had an ending in the can with the hearing in the Ninth Circuit Court in Portland in June of 2019. And following that, so it was time to get this really important story out and to get into the edit room. And we feel committed that when this case goes to trial, that we would like to be there with cameras on so we can do a short update or amend the film to follow what's happening in the court.
Right. So the plaintiffs are from all over the country. So I'm sure people are curious about how they got organized and why Eugene became kind of the central point before moving on to federal courts in San Francisco when the plaintiffs were scattered all over the country. Why did they all kind of coordinate into one conglomerate case, and why Eugene of all places?
Yeah, so Our Children's Trust is based out of Eugene, Julia's organization, and I believe there's 9 plaintiffs from the state of Oregon. Oh. So and because the Jordan Cove pipeline was a part of the complaint with this lawsuit, Oregon became the central hub for this case, which meant that the case was in the 9th District. Eugene is fortunate to have a federal district court in Eugene, and so that's where it landed, was with Judge Aiken originally. We see in the case that we also go to San Francisco and to Portland. San Francisco was, I believe that, San Francisco and Portland were both Ninth Circuit Court hearings. So that's why we left Eugene for those 2 hearings. But I think there was a little bit of a strategic attempt by the legal system, by the legal team, to have the case based out of Oregon. I mean, that was part of why they included the Jordan Cove pipeline, but also simply just by the fact that the majority or a majority number of plaintiffs are from Oregon is kind of why it landed there.
That makes sense. So your film does a great job of showcasing this. But regarding the whole climate change issue, it's been one that's been known for a long time, yet it seems like so little has been done because we've been arguing for decades as to whether or not it actually exists, rather than trying to address and fix the issue. Essentially just kicking the can down the road for future generations to have to deal with. And this film is incredible in showing that kids are sick of that ongoing delay, leaving it to them to have to solve. And something that it feels like that doesn't get nearly enough news coverage. And I say that my day job is a newspaper journalist, so that falls on me ever so slightly, along with all of my brethren. Do you think, though, that your film in the places where it's been able to show so far has started to maybe change that conversation a little bit?
Yeah, I can say something, and then Olivia can chime in too. I do think that what's really unique about this story is that we often talk about climate inaction, and I think a lot of folks in the media often also get this case wrong in citing that these kids have gone to court and are suing the government because of climate inaction, and that's wrong. Our government has not mitigated the impacts of climate change, but the reason that these kids have gone to court is because the government has willfully engaged in actions that are harming these young people. And that's the only way that you can have a constitutional claim, is by action and not by inaction. So, I think that's just an important thing to remember when we think about what has our government done or what has our government not done. We're very certain, and the evidence clearly shows, and the courts have clearly ruled in favor of the plaintiffs' statement in their lawsuit that the government has caused this harm.
I think I was going to say I think the other part of that too is that this film reframes that the issue of climate change, in that this is a constitutional right, that we have rights to a stable climate system, and if we don't take action to protect our climate, then these inalienable rights that are granted to us as American citizens are going to be in peril in the future. So these kids stepping up and framing this as a constitutional right, I think that's a new way of looking at this for a lot of people and a lot of audience members. I don't think we have really considered that. I know I hadn't considered that prior to this film and understanding this case. So I think that's a fresh way of sort of looking at it and understanding that we as citizens do have the right to sort of go to our elected officials and leaders and say, we need a stable climate. We need it for our futures and for our current standard of living as well.
It is interesting, just the age that we live in now. On good or bad, everything seems to get politicized, and we have such a toxic political landscape these days. This film, I'm curious if there's been any sort of pushback on it, because it is so central to Oregon, the outside perspective of, well, everyone in Oregon are anarchists, supreme leftist, and that's just not the case. And then also, people forget that this case is slow moving. It started during the Obama administration. Yes, it continued during the Trump administration, and it's still ongoing during the Biden administration. So it's not necessarily a left v right political issue. It is, like you said, a constitutional issue, right? But have you experienced any sort of pushback against this issue? Because this is something that does seem to, for good or bad, take sides politically, the overall climate change debate.
I think during my years of filming with the young people, there was some pushback that we got sometimes of people, criticizing the young people that they're pawns of their parents or pawns of this legal system, or something like that they've been brainwashed. But I think once you watch the story and you get to know these young people, you see very quickly that that's not the case. All of these people come from very different backgrounds. Alex and Jacob in Oregon come from a very conservative part of Oregon, in Roseburg, and their neighbors are all very conservative and Republican, and that's the environment in which they grew up. And so I think I think once people actually get to know these young people and they see that that's not the case. We tried really hard with this film, from in particular when we went back into the historical framework, of going back into the 50s and 60s and showing what the government knew. We tried really hard to not make this a partisan issue, but really to make this a general government issue, and that our government as a whole over the last 60 years has really failed us and failed to protect us. We didn't hold back on, being really harsh on President Obama and President Carter, because they very much played a role in where we are today. And we don't want to skew that in any way. And so, I think, as you said, climate change has been incredibly politicized, sadly, for way too long. And I think it's really hindered the U.S.'s ability to address the issue appropriately, and to get the backing of its citizens and society. But we're really trying to, I think, change that narrative with this film and show that this is both administrations. It has nothing to do with Democratic or Republic or liberal or conservative. This is a general harm, and it's a general right that we all have.
So, where have you, since it is COVID times, and there's been all sorts of changes to the film industry as a result, where have you been able to show this film, and what have audience reactions been that you've heard so far?
Well, we've been really fortunate to have been accepted into film festivals around the country, and in starting internationally too this fall. And we've been in all parts of the country too. We've been in the Pacific Northwest, we've been in Southern California, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, Arkansas, up in New York and New England. So it's been a story that has resonated around the country, which is fantastic. And a lot of that has been virtual screenings. There have been some in-person film festivals, but mostly it's been in a virtual setting. And we have also started outreach and started to do community screenings, and we're getting contacted by universities and colleges as part of our impact campaign. We'd like to make the film available for community screenings and for educational screenings. And we are continuing to work on a commercial distribution deal so that the film is widely available to an audience around the country and globally too.
Fantastic. So ultimately, what do you hope that people take away from watching Youth v. Gov?
I think we really hope that people will not only be inspired by these young people, but they'll be inspired to support them and to support the young people within their own communities. These 21 youth, while they may be the only ones that are involved in a constitutional climate change lawsuit in the U.S., in the federal court systems, there's hundreds, there's thousands of young people across the U.S. today who are climate activists and who are working to protect our climate and our future. And they all need support. They need support monetarily. They need support emotionally and mentally. It's really hard work, especially for the younger generation, to be working on something that they feel threatens their future. Our impact campaign is very focused on government responsibility and empowering and supporting young people and the communities around them to hold their governments accountable. And this can be anything from their local state governments, all the way up to the executive branch, from, as from school boards to local city council members, et cetera. There's all kinds of ways that people can engage in what we like to term as government responsibility, and holding those elected officials responsible.
And Olivia, your final thoughts?
Yeah, I would like people to walk away and remember that this is an urgent issue. And as you see in the film, the judicial system is slow moving. Hopefully, as the case progresses and goes to trial, that will be a great win for climate action. But I feel like we need to continue putting pressure on all branches of government, as well as on our local and national businesses and our local communities. I think, as we've seen from the UN climate report that came out this week, this issue is not easing up, and it's not getting any better, and it's urgent, and solutions need to be found now. So hopefully these kids are a source of inspiration for all of us to kind of get off the couch and join the fight.
Well, I did just buy an electric car, so I guess in a little teeny tiny way that's me doing my part. So, well, thank you both for this film, this extraordinary, informative, and in some ways shocking film, and for joining us. Youth v. Gov will be screened on Saturday, September 18th at 12:30 p.m. in our features category and available all week on demand. Christi and Olivia, thank you so much for the time. Thank you for all of the information and research that went into this film. We hope it's very informative for our audiences, and best of luck in all future endeavors.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having us, Kurt.
Thanks so much, Kurt.